Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for this lecture, The New Setting, COVID, Ukraine, and the New Global Order. It is my extreme pleasure to be hosting you at Temple Rome for a joint event with John Cabot Institute and John Cabot University and the Guarini Institute for Public Affairs. We have a wonderful lineup tonight. We will start with the main presentation and lecture by Professor Ron Linden, an Emeritus Professor from the University of Pittsburgh, who is an expert on security, on Eastern Europe, and who was my dissertation advisor. He has a long list of achievements. Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, the European Studies Center, and the EU Center of Excellence. He has also served as a researcher for Radio Free Europe in Munich, exactly when the wall fell. A long list of publications, and his research has expanded throughout his career. He's currently a co-editor of Turkey in Transition, the co-author and editor of the volume Turkey and Its Neighbors, Foreign Relations in Transition, and Turkey and the Balkans, New Forms of Political Community. He is also contributing author to the Berlin Wall 20 years later, published by the U.S. Department of State, and has also published extensively on China. He was also a fellow in Italy, most recently examining Chinese investments in Italy and in Europe. It is an enormous pleasure to have you with us tonight, Professor Linden, and we are also very happy to welcome Dr. Yiorghos Leventis, who is the Executive Director of the International Security Forum, and who is has studied in the UK and concluded extensive research in the archives on political struggle for self-determination. Right here at Temple University for 20 years. So it is wonderful to be working on this together, and also I'm very grateful for the opportunity that he has provided Temple and Temple students in holding a number of joint events at John Cabot University. So it's very nice that tonight we're returning the favor in a way of having this event here, and I look forward to many, many more in the future.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emilia, so much. Well, the truth is that at least the three of us are part of the same gang, specialists of Central and Eastern Europe. Yiorghos is kind of more southern, southeastern Europe. Actually, when I present my students with a blurb about European geography and politics, I say that Cyprus is geographically in the Middle East, but one of the most, if not the most European of all, which explains so many things about European contrasts. The topic that, okay, yes, Emilia, I taught here for 19 years. It's been a splendid experience, even though a little difficult to jump from one school to the other, but I was also younger. at the time. And I see a remarkable change in the outfit of the premises. This is really amazing. I like it a lot, and I'm, looking around as if I were totally new, even though I've been so many years in this place. And we've done several things together, as Emilia was mentioning, as the lockdown ended and in-presence events resumed, which was less than a year ago. We have done several events jointly, and I really hope we'll continue doing them because the collaboration is very, very fruitful. With regards to the topic, let me introduce briefly. The past 3 years, as far as Italy is concerned, it's 3 years and 5 days, because the first total lockdown started on March 9th, 2020, here. And it had different impacts on different generations and different kinds of people. I haven't, for example, I have to admit honestly, I'm sorry to introduce a personal impression here. I haven't suffered under the lockdown. I am, I don't know, I am, no, I have a character whereby I love to walk in the street and along the Tiber. I remember I walked on the Lungotevere in the middle of the streets, not on the sidewalk. With the cars that could come behind me, no car came behind me. I walked in complete silence. It was eerie. For a city like Rome, totally eerie. And I loved it. On the other hand, I have a teenage daughter, still teenage, who will end graduate school now, who suffered immensely. She suffered immensely, like most of her contemporaries, because socializing is totally paramount at that age, and you cannot socialize through the media, through what is it, whatever devilish device you guys use. It's not really, it's a fake socializing. The real socializing is being together, getting together, doing silly things together, studying together, etc. And the absence of it for 2.5 years has left a mark. I hope the scar can heal. I really hope so, but I'm not entirely sure yet. Therapy was needed, and the depression came in, as most depressions came in silently and not with great noise, not loudly, and it hasn't healed yet. Hopefully, it will very soon. By the way, another element before giving the floor to Professor Linden. My daughter did an exchange with a high school located in Indiana, southeast Indiana, bordering with Ohio, a city called Osgood, that is the middle of the deep US. Not glamorous places, Los Angeles, New York, no. Indiana, Osgood province, Mike Pence, etc., etc. The experience was very, very interesting. She enjoyed it, but the attitude towards COVID was totally opposite, completely opposite. COVID did not exist in that corner of the world. And if it existed, it was ignored completely. She might have caught it, she didn't realize. She might have healed. She certainly has healed. Tests were not made, masks were not worn, and New Year was celebrated by shooting at empty cans with real guns. So So it couldn't have been more of, let's say, an exchange, but she enjoyed it, even though, and it sort of cured the depression of the previous year, even though not completely. However, you guys are tough at that age. Most of you, not everybody, of course, and you can get over pretty much almost everything. So I am confident that she will be able to heal completely. On the other hand, I am affected by the current war more than I could possibly expect. It might be because I devoted my scholarly career to studying Eastern Europe. So I, as Emilia and Ron, have not a greater understanding, but a more complete, if you wish, understanding of the stakes that are implied in this conflict. And I dream about the conflict. I've been to Ukraine 8 times. I've been to 4 different cities. I have been to the city of Donetsk in 2005 for a conference, and I witnessed no ethnic or linguistic tension whatsoever. I have some kind of expertise on linguistic tensions. I've lived in Belgium. I go frequently to the German-speaking region of northern Italy, the Dolomites. So where Germans and Italians might be a little bit nervous vis-a-vis one another. I've been to Cyprus, by the way. So I'm familiar with ethno-linguistic tensions. There was none in Donetsk in 2005. Zero. Absolute zero. It's a complete fabrication. It's a pretext of the Russians to take issue at a country who wants to be independent. That is my certitude, my absolute certitude. Having said this, the impact of the conflict is very almost physical. I am in pains for our partner university, the Catholic University of Lviv in northwestern Ukraine, that has not been spared by bombings and launch of missiles, random. Let's start with, let's launch a missile. Ukraine, some Western leader has come to Ukraine, let's shoot a missile the next day. This is basically the strategy, the great military strategy of the Muscovites. I find myself thinking in pain about our partner school, about the many young people who have gone to war, not because they were forced at gunpoint, but because they thought it was good to defend their country. A number of them, unfortunately, haven't come back, or they have come back and they have been honored. The way you treat the people who die is a landmark of your attitude to life, to death, and to your level of civilization. If you are able to never leave anybody back and to rescue everybody, dead or alive, who is on your side, and even rescue the other side, then your moral level is pretty high, and you are deserving. I will not investigate further in what is being done in the current conflict, but I just wanted to compare 2 types of suffering. One, junior suffering because of the pandemic, and one senior suffering because of the war, because of personal involvement in the conflict. with this, I'm not saying that my daughter is not interested in the conflict. She is very interested in things, and she starts asking questions. Why do I feel bad about a lot of people not having the advantages that I have? Which is a good question to ask and not an easy one to answer. So I'll leave it here and pass the floor on to Professor Linden. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Federico. Professor Linden, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I invite my panelists to get the heck off the stage and, so they can see the slides. And I want to begin by thanking Professor Dean Emilia Zankina and Professor Federigo Argentieri, Director of the Guarini Institute of John Cabot, for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to think about this and present some propositions, which I hope you'll find completely preposterous and challenge. And if you don't, part of my talk involves telling you why I'm wrong. But I trust my discussant, Yiorghos Leventis, whom I also thank for being here, will take care of that. Let me locate, there we are. Through the miracle of technology. You might say what I'm doing is sending up a trial balloon. If you're paying attention to contemporary events, I'm trying to get a sense of what's going on now, what's happening out there. I want to thank my inviters, as I mentioned, and my discussant, who looks exactly like that, and invite you to think about one of the most difficult questions that we political scientists almost always try not to do, which is talk about what's happening now. It's fine to look at what happened 10 years ago or 5 years ago, but to try to get a sense, an analysis of what's happening now is the most challenging, which is partly why I appreciate the opportunity to give this talk. And if I'm wrong, then I'll deny that I ever said any of it, of course. So let me begin. I'm talking about a quick run through, and I apologize to Professor Pagliuolo, who knows all of this, whose students certainly do. The global power distributions over history have varied enormously. In the roughly 1878 Congress of Berlin to World War II, it was multipolar. You had France, you had Germany, Great Britain, Russia, the United States. Italy was formed as a country. From the end of World War II until 1991, collapse of the Soviet Union, you had clearly bipolar, two major powers, Russia, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And then a very brief period of unipolarity, where the United States was cock of the walk, to use an expression they would know in Osgood, Indiana. No one could challenge it. The United States could do what it wanted, but it didn't last very long, much shorter than those in Washington would have liked. You can roughly put it at about 2014, the first occupation in Ukraine. And then you had return to a multipolar system, and this would be concomitant with the rise of China, where everybody was taken by the rise of China, its economic power, especially its economic power. So the question I'm raising is, all right, what do we have now? What does it look like now? And my answer is the following. I propose that we are in a situation where the US, Europe, and Indo-Pacific, I don't have a good term for it, some people would call it the collective West, are the most powerful bloc, China and Russia. And so I've dubbed this unbalanced multipolarity. It is multipolar, but in my view, we are entering a period characterized by what I'll actually tell you. But before I tell you what it's characterized by, I want to put in the factors that I think explain why we're in this situation. That's why I gave this talk the title I did. I couldn't even get it all in there. The key factors, in my view, that explain the current distribution of of global power are the war in Ukraine, oops, hello, COVID, Brexit. Now, the plus sign I've put in here is not that they're positive, but that they contribute to the unbalanced polarity in that they do. We've also seen a change in norms. We have clearly a rise in populism/nationalism globally. I think that's undisputable. We have a rise in authoritarianism. And we have, sadly, a decline in democracy. We also have, this is my favorite factor because nobody else ever talks about it, what I call the fragmentation of the information environment. I'm going to have to dangle that out there and let you think about it, and I'll come back to it at the end, which should be 3 hours, 15 minutes. I know you'll be patient, and so will Yiorghos. This has produced, in my view, the following: a more powerful U.S., Europe, Indo-Pacific, a less powerful China. I'm going to try using these little arrows here. A much less powerful Russia, a return of great power norms. If you think back to those multipolar years where it was okay to invade your neighbor if you felt you were required, then there was a period where it wasn't, a brief period. And some troubling counter-trends, including Pache Fukuyama, the end of history. All right, now here's some data to back up my assertions. U.S., European economic power. United States and Europe together account for 25% of global exports, 33% of global imports. They account for 2/3 of all foreign direct investment globally. The two together, I think it's appropriate to lump them together, account for 44% of global GDP. Graphically, it looks like this. You see Europe 20%, United States 24%. Part of my approach is to overcome what I call China blindness, that the rise of China, which has been extraordinary, blinds us to the power of other significant actors, especially economically, and especially the United States and Europe. Europe receives 62% of all U.S. FDI. Europe receives 37 times more investment from the United States than China, and provides 70% of FDI into the U.S. European investment in the United States is 10 times European investment in China. U.S. trade in goods and services. One of my complaints is that trade indicators do not capture trade in services, which is important. It's 42% greater than European trade with China. In energy, the United States is now a leading supplier of liquefied natural gas, 25% of European imports, and more than Russian gas imports. And the U.S. and Europe together account for 57% of the global technical market. One of the reasons that I take this approach is that Europe has done an extraordinary thing, which is reduce its dependence on Russia, but on fossil fuels in particular. Look at this chart. This indicates how Europe has reduced its natural gas. Can you all see these, by the way? Good. These figures indicate the degree to which European countries have cut their natural gas consumption from all sources. And you can see a dramatic, I know this because the apartment I'm in here in Italy has no heat most of the day. So that was a surprise, but I'm making my contribution to the Ukraine war effort by not having heat. This was done at home with gloves on, I have to tell you. This was a surprise. I tried complaining that I was too old to live in a heated apartment, and I was told, get a life. Then look at this. This is EU 27 natural gas imports. It's a little funny to read, but this line represents the the level in 2021 from all sources. And the darker red line, natural gas imports in 2022, which you can see are sharply down. If you look at just Russia, natural gas imports are way down, as indicated by the darker red line. Who's making up for it? The United States. LNG imports are significantly higher, and the United States is the major supplier. So Europe has weathered, so far, wrenching change in energy, and has, most importantly, cut the tie to Russia. And I'm telling you, in my view, they're not going back. I doubt very much if that will return. In addition, the European economies and the US economies have bounced back, not so much from Ukraine, but from what happened from COVID. In this chart, you can see very clearly the GDP dip during the years of COVID, but all of them have bounced back, even Greece, have bounced back and produced this level of annual growth. I admit 2.5, 1.8, those aren't great. That's a separate topic I want to raise later on. But if you look at European Union exports, you see a steady increase. Again, a dip during COVID and a steady increase. Same with imports. The European Union trade balance, not quite so healthy, but coming back. United States trade in goods and services, same thing. I guess my point is that the European economies and the United States have been resilient in the face of these dual challenges, COVID and Ukraine. And in addition, Croatia just joined the Eurozone, so there are now no fewer than 20 countries which are together in the Union. I'm old enough to remember when they talked about doing this. And I was in Germany at Radio Free Europe, and they said that they'll never give up the Deutschmark. And the French will never give up the franc. They'll never. But they did. And now you have 20 countries, including all the major economies of Europe, that are part of Europe. It's really a remarkable story. Okay, what about COVID? Now, you can see these charts, good. These charts are various different ways of measuring how countries have responded to COVID. Weekly test rates, 14-day case, hospital, emergency. And these data are prepared by the European Center for Disease Control and Prevention. And every single one of those indicators is down and down sharply. Europeans have done a very good job. And that's not counting, this chart doesn't show, roughly 2 trillion euros provided by the EU itself, by the ECB, for recovery, part of this, it's called Next Generation EU funding, bonds, and information sharing. The EU has done a hell of a job against all expectations. Now, when I presented these results to my friend who happened to be in Rome, who's an epidemiologist, he said, well, the problem, Ron, is these indicators are, they can be fixed, they're manipulated, and they all tend towards zero. I didn't believe him, but he bought me dinner, so I pretended to. But he suggested another indicator called, this is a little bit gruesome, excess deaths. It's a measure of how many people die versus how many people are born, and then how many die that are in excess, and you can attribute it to COVID. And if you look at this chart, it's really remarkable. This is a global chart. Here are the excess deaths, and here are the official deaths. What I wanted to point to you in this chart is this. Look at Europe's rate. Almost zero. United States, North America. And now look at Asia. The Europeans and the Americans have, one way or another, not perfectly all the time, but they have managed it. And what that has produced for the European Union is a positive view, especially historically. There was a dip in, you can see the question here, positive views, and a very positive view especially compared to maybe 10 years ago, of the EU. These are Eurobarometer findings of people who live in the EU. Attitudes towards membership is at an all-time high. The public is somewhat divided on COVID, but they have an overall very positive view. There's other data, which I'm not going to show you, supporting EU foreign policy, policy towards Russia, towards sanctions. And it is a generally positive orientation, especially historically, compared to. Now remember, we've got talking about 27 countries here, and the general view is quite positive. All right, you say, but what about Brexit? Now, Brexit, of course, was supposed to cripple the EU and bring with it a whole bunch of other countries. There was talk about a Dutch exit and a Frexit and a Polexit and every kind of term you could come up with. When the UK left, by the way, economic models of the UK economy suggest that the UK economy is 5% smaller than it would have been had it stayed within the EU. Here, there's a dip in exports around COVID, but what I wanted to point to is that intra-EU trade, which is crucial since for the European countries, something like 2/3 of their trade is with each other, has continued to increase. And there's no more talk about Frexit or Belexit or any of those others. The EU did lose its most militarily capable country in the form of the UK. But of course, that doesn't affect Europe. You notice I called it Europe, US and Europe, not just the EU. And we talk about NATO in a moment. People should also remember that the EU, though not a military alliance, has substantial military missions, especially in Europe. In case you had forgotten, here's this map. These are all EU programs, stations. Some are training, some are provision, some are administrative, and there are more than 4,000 personnel sent by the EU. This is not NATO, and it's not the United States. So the EU has responded, and my argument is they have not just survived, but thrived without the Brits. Okay, then the war in Ukraine. You notice how I'm blending in all of these different factors. I hope so, because if you don't, I'll just keep reminding you of that. In response to the war in the Ukraine, the EU has taken several concrete, real measures, including the European Defence Fund, which was always there, but now has a permanent, what they call in Brussels speak, permanent structured cooperation. They developed their plans for the first rapid deployment force. The European Peace Facility is providing the first military assistance by an EU institution directly, and the first to a state in war, training EU soldiers in the European Union, and increasing defense spending on the country level. 5 countries which are members of both the EU and NATO have increased their defense spending, one which is just in NATO, and Sweden. According to Natalie Tocci, director of the IAI here in Rome, Europeans have begun to put their money where their mouth is. In addition, speaking of that, if you look at aid to Ukraine of all types globally, which is monitored by the Kiel Institute in Germany, the United States leads the league. Most of that is military. Next is EU countries and institutions, as you can see by this chart. Now, it depends, funnily enough, on when you count it. If you looked at just before the beginning of the year, that is the end of last year, the EU was actually ahead of the United States. Now, the EU doesn't match the US in military aid, but in terms of actual funding, and this chart is most interesting to me because it includes actual dispersed funds here, as well as committed budgetary support. The EU has stepped up, just as they did in COVID, just as they did in response to Brexit. And the real test one of the real tests, has to do with sanctions on Russia. Again, to the surprise of almost everybody, the EU has adopted all of these sanctions. The travel bans and the asset bans affect more than 10,000 people and institutions, vehicles, transport. Russians have been cut out from the SWIFT financial system and IT services. And exporting raw materials, importing a whole bunch of things in Visa, and against all expectations, Europe has led the world and continued to add new sanctions. If you look at defense expenditure, this is what I mentioned before. I apologize, it's a little bit hard to read. You can see general growth throughout. Now here's NATO, not just EU, but it's been way beyond that. The EU has been brought back to life in a way, reinforced its mission, restated its mission, even made commitments to Moldova, which most of us couldn't find on a map if you gave us a map of Moldova. I mean, it's a hard, small place, could be dangerous, and NATO has indicated its commitments. And furthermore, this to me is among the most interesting and what makes this global. In its recent strategic paper, NATO added the Indo-Pacific as an area of concern. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, US and Europe, now cares about the Indo-Pacific. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? Is it likely to lead to conflict? I don't know the answer to that, but I know it's not what Vladimir Putin wanted out of NATO. And once again, this is why I'm arguing that the sort of collective West has strengthened. But there's more to it than that. Europe has, for the last several years, been distancing itself from China. I'm proud and happy to say that Emilia and I did an article on, we called it Divorce Italian Style, about how the Italians were moving away from the Chinese. And as you probably know, you may know, Italy's the only European economy to have signed on to the BRI. We're not sure if that will be continued. It's a great story, and we should hand out free copies afterwards. Anyway, Europe has been moving away from China, from its love embrace with China. And by love embrace, this is what I mean. European investment in the EU, now UK is still included there, has been huge for 20 years. Italy, by the way, comes in second or third. It depends on what year you mention. But here's the factor I want to point to. This is what Chinese investment in Europe looks like in the last 10 years. Straight down. Here's what EU investment in China looks like. Also down. Now, taking account of COVID, and it hasn't bounced back. Business has indicated its criticisms of Chinese practices across a range of areas: intellectual property, technology transfer. And they have published these in numerous areas. This is not just related to the war in Ukraine. This is related to Chinese practices which European businesses have complained about. The investment treaty that was signed, took years to negotiate between the EU and China, is stalled in the European Parliament over human rights issues. They're getting a lot of pressure from the United States about the export of technology. And for the first time, you're seeing an uptick in investment screening. Investment screening is when a country reviews all investments from foreign actors, whether they might endanger national security or include some control over resources that they don't want to be controlled. In 2017, that's what the map looked like. Did I show it? No, I didn't. There we go. This is the map of countries that had its screening mechanisms in 2017. This is what that map looks like now. In addition to those national ones, the EU itself has a screening mechanism. Now, the EU cannot block, but it can do a lot to lobby against it. In Italy, this has actually happened several times, use of what they call the golden powers. That's not helping the EU-China relationship. China was identified as a systemic rival in the 2019 strategic paper. Human rights criticisms and sanctions, and I mentioned the investment treaty, suppression of the Uyghurs, the rise of Xi Jinping to a position of unchallenged power. He was just re-elected president for an unprecedented third term. The swaggering Chinese nationalism, the rise of Taiwan. Let me give you an example of how this plays out. Tiny Lithuania, no offense to Lithuanians, tiny but muscular Lithuania, set up a trade office in Vilnius that had the word Taiwan in it for dealing with Taiwan. And all the countries do it, but they do it without official. They set up a trade office with the word Taiwan in its title. Beijing went berserk and started imposing all sorts of sanctions on them and blasting them and criticizing them and cutting back exports and shifting. In response, the EU stood behind Lithuania and passed what they call an anti-coercion measure, in which it will respond to attacks like this against by what they call third parties, but they clearly mean China. Taiwan, I'll come back to, and it has become an issue. You now have a public opinion which is not so sure that it wants to have trade deals with China. 48% expressed skepticism in a study published by the European Council on Foreign Relations. More broadly, COVID contributed greatly to souring the relationship between the EU and China, partly because of the Chinese mismanagement of their own information. They were accused of digital authoritarianism. The EC issued a long report detailing Chinese disinformation campaigns. There were counter-narratives. Those of you that live in Italy know that this had an enormous impact when the Italians accused the Chinese countered and accused the Italians. It was not a pleasant aid preferences, and it produced this kind of public opinion. Negative assessments of China's coronavirus response, and you can see they are, for the most part, this is how many people think China has done a bad job. This is negative. Now you get to the war in Ukraine, and that adds to the items that Europeans are unhappy about China, both at the official level and at the public level. And you see this statement, and I've highlighted the crucial aspect of it. This is as close as a diplomat will come to saying something bluntly and critically about another country. And this was pretty sharp. Okay, so my major point is that the Western countries, and I focus on the EU, and I haven't got to the Indo-Pacific yet, have been resilient and powerful against all expectations and are in a stronger position. China is, on the other hand, weaker. This is the figure for Chinese economic growth. You remember the figures you saw on Europe. And of course, China used to have quite gaudy figures, to the extent that you can believe them. Dipped in period of COVID, and then sort of puttering along, but certainly not what they had in the past, and definitely not what they need. If you look at China's outward FDI, foreign direct investment, and you saw how important that was in Europe, in the last 5 years, you see a steady deterioration. These are figures, by the way, put together by the American Enterprise Institute to counter what they think are suspicious figures by the Chinese ministry. Inward FDI into China looks like it's picking up, according to official Chinese statistics. But more detailed studies, as indicated here, greenfield projects and merger and acquisition, shows a steady decline. and greenfield transactions a steady decline. Translation, countries and firms are not investing in China in the way they were before, and China needs it. And China, in 2013, announced a global program called the Belt and Road Initiative. Most of you are familiar with that. Mostly to developing countries, huge amounts of money that were to be invested by state and private enterprises. And look at these figures here. You see it has also declined, especially sharply in the last couple of years. And partly this is a problem because many of these countries found themselves in debt. China didn't give its money away, by the way. These were loans. You give a loan to a country like Sri Lanka, it builds a bridge or an airport, and then they pay you back the loan. That's a very good deal for you until they can't pay back the loan. As it happens, in Sri Lanka, when they couldn't pay back the loan, the Chinese took the port that they had helped them build with their money. That didn't win them any friends, by the way, throughout Africa and other parts of Asia. China's foreign trade has recovered. You see some gaps here. That's exports. This is imports. China's trade has come back with Europe. And these figures show the European trade with China in goods and services. Again, here services have improved. But if you look at export growth percentage over the last 5 years, that's not great. This is not a great picture for the Chinese. The same with imports. The Chinese picture is complicated by the fact that the United States is on a serious campaign to limit exports of technology to China. It was begun by Donald Trump. It has not been reversed by Joe Biden. In fact, it's been expanded in terms of, with an executive order, the United States has expanded its control, or is trying to, not just of U.S. firms, but of foreign firms that have U.S. components, to block the Chinese from importing technology. They already have control over investments into, and there is a proposal for the United States to review for technological issues external investment going the other way. All of that has had its impact. Trade, this is one of the most staggering figures I came up with when preparing this. Trade in China represents 37.5% of its GDP. That Chinese growth figures that you saw, those 8 and 9, they were fueled by trade. And the Chinese need that trade for the following reason. The Chinese and most authoritarian countries make a deal. They let people's lives get better. You want to buy a car, you want to have a house, you want to travel, you want to send your children to university in the United States, fine. You can do all those things. You go get rich. Just stay out of politics. And if you do that, you'll be fine. Well, that works as long as you, the government, can come across. As long as you have the goods. As long as you have things that you can sell them and places that you can go. If your economy is heading down and your exports are down and people aren't investing in you anymore, how are you going to keep things quiet? The answer is, of course, nationalism always helps, and increased authoritarianism, both of which you see in China. But that's not the real monster in the closet. Here's the monster in the closet. Chinese population growth in this period was consistently high. One-child policy gradually implemented, still not too bad. And now, Chinese population growth, in fact, in 2022 was negative. Chinese population, this gives you a sense of the numbers, by the way, declined by 850,000. That's, 6 Pittsburghs? It's unbelievable. It declined by... So, here's the other problem. The working age, as a percentage of the population, has steadily declined. You need people that are not my age, but are your age, to work, to pay for all of us as we retire. Look at this figure. The percentage of Chinese population, life is getting better. It has for some time. People have better nutrition. People have better access to a better life. Well, they're going to live longer. Now you have this, which leads to the following crunch. Working age dependency. This is a social science statistic that rates the percentage of people who are working as compared to the percentage of people who are not working. What you have here is a ratio that's about 1 to 1. That's not good. You don't want it. You want it to be 4 to 1, or maybe 5 to 1. That is, 4 or 5 people are working to support the one who's retiring. If you get one person working to support, that's not the direction you go. Where's your economy going to grow? How are you going to fill your armed forces? How are you going to do all the things that you say you're going to do in the great China dream? In fact, I have an answer to that question. I'm glad you asked. This is what happened to Italy. As the median age in Italy grew, the GDP growth rate straight down. As the percentage of elderly grew, same thing. Old age dependency, same thing. This is China's future unless they can reverse it. In fact, these charts came from an article I found called "The Chinese Century is Already Over." I don't know if that's too strong, but it supports my view that what we have here is a weaker China. At the same time, of course, growth of unfavorable views. The bloom is off the rose. There's lots of things that are making people unhappy about China. You can see this in every country in Europe. There's negative views, and they're ascribable to COVID, as I mentioned, and the war in Ukraine. This is the impact that the war in Ukraine had on the views of China. And you can see the percent that agree and strongly agree that they are skeptical of China's view. And that's before we get to the Indo-Pacific. There are increasingly a number of people who are worried that what's happening in Ukraine could happen in Taiwan, that China is watching. They are learning. They are learning what to do and what not to do if they want to take back Taiwan, leaving aside the legalisms that everybody legally, officially agrees that Taiwan is part of China. What they don't want is a Ukraine war in South Asia. This is some of the things that have happened. Japanese defense spending has doubled. The Japanese have reconceived of their notion of what it means to have a self-defense force. They've militarily upgraded. This is a verbatim quote from the National Security Strategy of Japan from last December. They labeled China an unprecedented and greatest strategic challenge. The Japanese long sort of post-World War II pacifism is over, and now it's going to carry its weight. You see a Quad security group, the United States, India, Australia, and Japan, a U.S., several. Those of you that pay attention to this know that the United States just got positioned to put bases in 4 new islands in the Philippines, and made a deal to sell nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. Now, regardless of whether you think this is a good thing or a bad thing, they are working out. They are putting muscle behind China. And of course, the Chinese have noticed this. And, oh, by the way, the EU also has some strategic deployments. The UK, Germany and the Netherlands actually have ships. And here's one of the reasons why. Before I get to that, let me quote the Japanese foreign minister who said, "Ukraine today could be East Asia tomorrow." People are paying attention. The war in Ukraine has made a huge difference. And countries, India was always worried about this. But now other countries are not just worried about it, but doing things that are strengthening them and, in my view, making a relatively speaking, weaker China. In the South China Sea, there are competing claims for territory there. And you can see this by this chart. Competing claims including the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, but the Chinese claim all of that within the red line. Well, that's an area for conflict, and within that line they have militarized islands, and where there weren't any islands, they have built islands and then put military substations on them. Why do the Europeans care about this? Well, 40% of EU trade goes through from China goes through the Straits of Malacca. You do not want a conflict there, but everybody is getting ready for one. And that was before you had balloons being blown up over the United States. Now, I realize my time is not infinite, though I wish it was. I'm sure you do too. But I do want to talk about Russia. Remember I said a stronger U.S., Europe, a weaker China, and the current situation, in my view, is a much weaker Russia. Take a look at these figures. This is non-EU imports of natural gas. In 2021, Russia provided almost 40%. Barely a year later, it's down to 15%. Now, those of you that know Russia know that the export of these raw materials are vital to their economy. It's really the only thing they have to sell. I'll come back to that. In oil, same thing. 25% of the extra EU imports came from Russia. Now it's 14%. Russian GDP growth straight down. FDI flows into Russia also straight down. Exports and imports down. You can't possibly go through all of this, but these are the symbols of the thousands of companies who pulled out of Russia. They're not doing business there anymore, or they've drastically reduced. But that's not the worst thing. This is Russia's monster in the closet. And the figures are staggering. Nearly 500,000 people have left Russia because of what's happened, because of the war, because of Russia is now cut off from the rest of the world. Young people, smart people like you, who don't want to be in a country where they can't buy the things they've gotten used to. Look at these numbers, 112,000 to Georgia. And I'm going to tell you, the people who've left, they're the ones that the Russians need. Here's a Yale School of Management did a study, and of the 500,000, 50% are highly educated or work in skilled sectors, ultra high income people, and capital. As much as they can, they take their money with them. So the Russians are losing the sinews of a modern economy. And this is because of sanctions and attitude towards Russia. And I'm guessing this might not come back either. I don't think the people will go back. Now, you may say, well, what about oil imports to China? Yes, oil imports to China have gone up. But look at the price. So China is buying more oil from Russia, which has a hard time selling it to anybody else, at a cheaper price. They've traded away the ties they had with the West, with Western society, technology, for selling their oil to China. That is not going to move them forward. And that's just the start of the story. Here's some more of the story. You have a NATO that is Vladimir Putin's nightmare. It is reinforced. It is expanding. They'll have new members. It is expanding its commitments. Vladimir Putin and the people around him greatly underestimated Western resolve, partly because the West didn't do much of anything in 2014 when the Russians took Crimea and occupied Donetsk and Luhansk. The Russian military has, shall we say, not shown itself to be the fighting force it wanted to, partly because of corruption, of the derailing of monies elsewhere, training, a whole bunch of other issues that are outside my area of expertise. So I'll just have to plagiarize the answers when I present this. The indictment of the whole political system. It's Putin and the people around him. There's no chance for anybody to publish an article that says, do you think we should be doing this, Vlad? Or a political party to organize? Well, what happens then is you get the policies that one person or those around him want to put forth, with the catastrophic consequences that you see. And you have the return of what I call outlaw Russia. Russia's now back on the sort of outs. There was this hope, this dream, especially in Germany, that if you traded with Russia, if you dealt with them, if you built a kind of quasi-democracy, eventually they would look like us. We can do things. There'd be political parties and free press, and well, there was for a while, and there isn't anymore. And that has made it difficult and not exactly what Putin had in mind. Okay, I'm almost at the end, but here's where I want to do something. I'm going to steal Yiorghos' thunder. This is what I promised to do before. I'm going to tell you why. So that's my picture, right? Stronger West, for lack of a better term, weaker, strong but weaker China, much weaker Russia. That's what I call unbalanced multipolarity. Okay, change hats. Linden, you are so wrong. Now I'm going to tell you why I'm wrong. And by pointing to counter trends. Or let me put it this way, let me soften my own criticism. Why I might be wrong. This is what I always say to my wife when she tells me I'm wrong. I might be wrong. Business is apolitical. There are a lot of people who say business is evil, they're nasty, they deal with anyone. They're not. They're just in business. As they say in the mafia movies, right? Nothing personal, just business. Oh, shouldn't say that in Italy, I guess. Business isn't finished yet. They may be moving things around, they may be looking elsewhere, but business wants to make money. And they are going to work hard to undo some of what I just told you. Let me give you an example. When the United States start talking about controlling technological investment in China, not just trade, business is deeply opposed to that measure. It hasn't been made law yet. And their lobbies are working in the United States to oppose that. Why? Because that's how they make money. Their business 80%, 87% of European investment in China comes from 4 countries. And one of the tops is Germany, and there's automakers and BASF and pharmaceuticals. You think they're going to go gently into that good night unless this trend continue? I don't think so. So that's a counter trend. Same thing with trade. They're companies that make money in trading are going to do what they can to undo or maybe evade what's happened. Third, I know I'm countering China blindness, but let's remember that China is a gigantic force in the global economy. It's the leading country in manufacturing. It's the world's leading exporter, second leading importer, third FDI, and it has almost total control of what they call rare earth metals. They're in a powerful position. China is not Russia. So the US and the West can sort of kick Russia around. I'm not sure they can do that at China. And China has something Russia doesn't have, which is alternatives. They have huge amounts of investment in the global South, in Southeast Asia, in Africa. They have alternatives. Okay, Russia. Speaking of Russia, Russia has been able to resist sanctions. They have been able to avoid sanctions on the shipment of oil, for example, by using non-registered tankers, by using sort of variety. But I don't think it's enough to make up for what they've lost, but they can get around it. I'm reminded of Churchill, Diego, correct me if the source is wrong, famous statement that Russia is never so strong as she looks, nor as weak as she appears. So let's not write Russia off yet, but I think there's a counter, especially if you look at these figures. China, by the way, is not the only importer of Russian oil, also India, and I didn't put this in here, but I'm sure Yiorghos will mention it, also Turkey. Here's a curious aspect to this. These sanctions especially, and the pressures on technology export to China are pushing these countries to become more self-sufficient, to decouple from the US-dominated, Western-dominated economy, the bank system, the finance system, the dollar-denominated economy. I'm not sure that's a result that the Western companies want, countries want, but they're pushing them to do that so that we can't twist their arms anymore. They're going to, in fact, they've already done this. Russia has set up a payment system. China has set up a payment system. So that may there's a reasonable question about how long EU unity will last. The EU has some serious issues. Those low level of economic growth, the disparity between the North and the South, the issue of immigration, and the rise of nationalism, which is my other factor. If you look across the globe, you see nationalist parties either in power or close to power, starting right here in Italy, in Sweden, powerful challenges in Germany, in France, a nationalist government in Israel, and of course in China itself. This is not a recipe for further cooperation. And here's what I say: the end of history. If the West is so powerful, I'll put this in a provocative form, then how come democracy is declining all over the world? Where's that powerful image that Fukuyama said would produce the end of history? And for a while there, we saw that. I was in Radio Free Europe when the wall came down. I was the duty officer the night the wall came down in Berlin. They called me at home and said, "Ron, you better come in the office. The Berlin Wall just opened up." And I said, "What have you been smoking?" Because this couldn't possibly be true. And remember, all of the EU countries that were communist, 300 million people were in a democracy. You had a spread around the world. Well, I'm sorry to tell you, it doesn't look like that anymore. These are the number of countries which have gotten better scores from the Freedom House, Freedom in the World survey. Countries that improved in 2005, that number has steadily declined, whereas the number of countries where it's gotten worse has steadily increased. And here's a really frightening chart. The share of the world's population that lives in a free environment, which had been 46% in 2005, is now down to 20%, while those that live in partly free or not free has gone up. The reason I mention this is, if the West is so powerful and doing so well, why aren't more people living in democracies? Not just the same, but democracy appears to be losing the global battle. And finally, I promise this is finally, I told you this is my favorite factor, the fragmentation of the global environment. What I've just described to you, my prejudices, which just might have leaked through in some of this, are not shared around the world. Here's the proof. I'm nothing if not data-driven. People were asked, what's your view of Russia, ally or rival? In the United States, in the EU, in Great Britain, pretty clearly that Russia is seen as a rival, but not in India, not in China, and not in Turkey. In other words, the world, parts of the world, indeed by population, most of the world doesn't necessarily see it the way we do. So that might mean that the world will develop very differently, because not everybody thinks that Ukraine matters or should be defended, because even though we do, and many of them think they're living in a democracy. Let me end with this quote. The global order is neither inherently robust nor inherently fragile. It has exactly as much strength as those who value it can muster. Thank you. I was going to say sorry I ran over, but I'm not sorry. I think we should. We know you, sir. Yiorghos? Remember, I'm
Professor Linden. My role would be really minor. I don't want to bother you for too long. I'll present some added value to the thoughts and assessments of Professor Linden, especially as we are generally in agreement. And I am tired because traveling from little backwater Cyprus, it took me a full day yesterday to reach Rome. And I leave time for discussion with a drink and a bite. I think it's better. Well, I think we are in full agreement that the world affairs is characterized by US super hegemony, though I would also agree that there is an unbalanced multipolarity. I have also looked into, as a security analyst, expert, into military budgets of the main powers. And so the US defense budget for 2023 is $858 billion. This is almost 1 trillion. Second largest is China. Over the past 3 years, China has seen an increase in military budget annually of about 6 to 7%, hovering around 6 to 7%. But in 2022, China has a military budget of 230 billion US dollars, which is still just 1/4 of the US equivalent. Russia has a military budget of $75 billion in 2022, to rise to 84 billion in 2023. And this is 40% more than what was initially announced in 2021. Interestingly, the 4-year projection for Russia's defense budget, 2022 to 2025, is for $600 billion, which betrays an exponential growth, averaging about $150 billion per annum. But still, it is a fraction of the US budget. It's 1/5 to 1/6 of the US equivalent. India has, for the previous year, 2022, about $77 billion defense budget, and it is the highest after US and China. So Russia is actually fourth. The UK just committed an extra 6 billion, as the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has rated China as an epoch-defining challenge. UK budget is about $68 billion in 2021. In terms of foreign bases around the world, the US has military bases spread across 80 countries. Their number is 750, and these are the disclosed ones. I mean, they're probably much more undisclosed. Second comes the UK with 145 bases around the world, not least in my native little Cyprus, where the UK has 2 sovereign base areas and about 40 retained sites. And this is very, very little known around the world, that the Treaty of Establishment of the Republic of Cyprus bears more relevance to a status of forces agreement than to a Bill of Rights for the Cypriot citizens. It has 12 articles. 6 out of the 12 articles speak about the rights of the British forces on the island, where they can move, what they can use, and so on and so forth. And the status of the British bases on the island is sui generis. They were baptized as sovereign in the Treaty of Establishment that is a SOFA sort of document. I challenge this view, but anyway, around 145 bases in the UK. Russia comes third with 35 bases, around 35 bases around the world. And this is a grievance that Vladimir Putin puts across time and again during his speeches and press conferences. Why do you blame me? Blame the US. They have hundreds times more bases around the world. And fourth is China, that has only 5 bases around the world, outside Chinese territory. So I'm not sure which is more weaker, Russia or China. In terms of military presence abroad is China. But definitely they are on the weak side. So the US has 120 bases in Japan, where I lived for 2 years as a postdoctoral fellow of the United Nations University. Here I bring some added value to you about my view about international organizations. And here is where I reinforce the Professor Linden's argument that we are in an unbalanced multipolarity. And I would add to this that we have entered an era of a militarization of world affairs. The statistics I quoted about defense budgets of main powers are on the rise. So instead of detente and disarmament, we have a continuous increase in defense budgets, more weapons production, and we do not know where this will lead as yet. Now, what this increasing militarization of world affairs by great power rivalry comes as a result, to my mind, of number one, deregulation. We are into a trend of withdrawal from treaties. We have seen withdrawal of the US from a treaty about the nuclear program of Iran. And now the new administration, correct me if I'm wrong, Biden administration is sitting on the fence. They are considering whether to come back. Then withdrawal from the START treaty. Then Moscow retaliates with shelving one of the treaties. This is where we are standing at a point where weapons of mass destruction, the nuclear threat has come to the fore. And for what it is worth, I think world leaders need to pay attention to Putin's addresses and his increasing talk about using tactical nuclear weapons when he says this is not a bluff. Do we afford not to take him seriously? He's a man that is in power for more than 20 years in the Kremlin. He most probably is intoxicated by power. It is a worrying sign. By the way, incidentally, most of my European research activity is with the network of independent think tanks on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation studies. And on the one hand, I am sad that I come from two insignificant countries. By the way, I'm a dual citizen of both the Cyprus Republic and the Hellenic Republic. The Hellenic Republic has granted me honoris causa the citizenship by 45 years delay. Nuclear disarmament studies are nowhere to be seen in university curriculum. They are not taught, and there is not any kind of budget, not even to pay teachers at state universities in Greece who teach basic courses like diplomatic history, and this I'm quoting verbatim what the Greek Minister of Education in charge of state universities has told me in private. On the other hand, I am proud that I have it as a personal mission to represent both Greece and Cyprus in this very worthwhile network, which is funded, by the way, by the European Council to produce ideas on how to go on weapons of mass destruction, disarmament, and not proliferation. I fully agree with Professor Linden's remark that the war in Ukraine has strengthened the military arm of the EU in this respect. So, number two, regarding the trend for militarization of world affairs, is that we have a total absence of any credible multilateral security organization. The Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, is the only multilateral security organization in Eurasia, seems to have evaporated in thin air in the face of Russia's invasion of the Donbass. There is paralysis in the midst of recriminations, and this is the order of the day in the weekly meetings of the General Council in Vienna. Very sad, but a very hard fact. By the way, let me refer to a personal experience. Since 2015, I am part of the reserve list of experts on dialogue facilitation and mediation, which is kept by the Center, Conflict Prevention Center in the OSCE Secretariat in Vienna. Now, trust me that I've spent time, effort, and money in many trips to Vienna trying to find out if the center is embarking on new missions. When I did smell that there was trouble in the air at the beginning of February of last year, I fired an email to the head of the center, and I offered myself to embark on a mission without notice. My request was ignored. That was the 1st of February. On the 15th of February, I sent the kind reminder. The kind reminder was forwarded to an inferior, and I just got a stereotypical answer from this inferior official of the Conflict Prevention Center that no more mission is contemplated. Well, 1 week later, Russia invaded Donbass, and soon after, the most populous OSCE mission, the special monitoring mission in eastern Ukraine of observers that were meant to observe the implementation of the Minsk agreement, just rose the white flag and ran into Rostov-on-Don, into Russia, into safe territory. And the end of the story. And I leave you to draw your own conclusions. The UN is a multilateral organization that is supposed to promote security and peace and prosperity in the world. I served for 2 years in the United Nations University headquarters in Tokyo. And this is, I think, the most important part of my wealth experiences, as it opened a new window for me. And I came to understand how the UN works from inside. Now, the UN University has as its mission to be the strategic think tank of the UN and its agencies. This is in the constitution of the UN University. Yet, could anyone just have a guess in what sort of budget does the UN University, with such a pompous mission to be the UN strategic think tank, and what sort of budget it works, and what sort of budget the program I worked for had, the Peace and Governance Program? You will fall down from your chairs. $45 million was the total budget of this World University, and we had, for Peace and Governance Program, just $500,000 budget. So you can imagine what we could do with this. So the UN is long lost its credibility, and it's reduced to talking shop. May I dare ask, how many of you in the auditorium know that the UN Charter provides for a revision of its charter every 10 years? Have you ever heard about this provision? Well, it does. And since 1945, the year of the adoption of the UN Charter, we should have had 7 reviews, heading towards the 8th one in 2025. How many reviews have been effected? 0, none. In a nutshell, the principle of indivisible security, which imbued multilateral security organizations like the OSCE, like the UN, is gone with the winds of multiple conflagrations in the post-World War II era. Weapons of mass destruction. Let me give you very, very basic hard facts, just in a paragraph. Approximately 90% of all nuclear warheads in the world are owned by Russia and the US, which each one has around 4,000 warheads in their military stockpiles. No other nuclear armed state sees a need for more than a few hundred nuclear warheads for national security. This is, I'm quoting the website of the Federation of American Scientists. But I do stress that Vladimir Putin, in recent addresses, increasingly talks about the use of tactical nuclear warheads. Also, is number 2 in the Russian Security Council. Dmitry Medvedev has also made similar threats. We need to think about a solution, a practical solution to end the bloodshed in Ukraine. And we need to think of what may go in the minds of those who rule in the Kremlin. Because some face-saving solution from Kremlin's perspective may be needed in order to avert a nuclear disaster. And let me offer my final word on how the bloodshed in Ukraine may be ended, because I am also having equally nightmares about the horrors of war and atrocities committed there. I have lived through war. I was only 6 years of age when a massive Turkish military force invaded my own island. And I do know what invasion and occupation means. I have also personal experience on the world stage and on the peace talks in Cyprus itself. So I served in the Security and Guarantees Working Group for a comprehensive settlement of the Cyprus problem, and we met 12 times with the Turkish side. My honest conclusion is that a compromise always works, and I share with you my thought that the overarching principle for a compromise settlement is land for peace. Under circumstances of invasion and occupation by a powerful neighbor, the land for peace may be a recipe, a way out. In 1974, Turkey invaded Cyprus and captured almost 40% of the island. Not 20%, which is roughly the size of the Turkish minority in Cyprus that was purportedly invading to protect, and which is the size of the Ukrainian territory captured by Russia. Whether we like it or not, we may have very different, diverse perspectives. Russia is the great neighbor of Ukraine, and the Russian political elite perceives of Ukraine as their own backyard, and this perceive of the Ukrainians as partaking in their culture. This needs to be taken seriously into account. So Ukraine will also live under the hard shadow of the Russian bear, as much as Cyprus, which has an 80% Greek majority, has to live under the very hard shadow of the Turkish wolf of 85 million Turks to the north. So my last word again, land and peace, land for peace, political settlement, compromise.
I'm going to execute a coup here and take on the role of moderator. But I see Emilia's coming up here as well. She's gonna talk about pizza, but you don't want to hear about pizza. I would like to hear some questions, challenges, especially from the students who've been kind enough to attend.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yes. So thank you, Ron, and thank you, Yiorghos. We do have not pizza, but other even better food and drinks. And we have about 10 minutes. So let's start by taking 3 questions and see whether we have time for more. Any questions from students before we go to Diego? I know Diego has a question.
Students are knocked out.
Okay, Diego.
Okay, thank you. So first, actually, I have I bribe my students into coming here with the promise of pizza. So I hope I'm not in trouble. You know, I hope I'm not in trouble.
No, it's good food.
Okay. Now I have, this is the serious observation. Something trivial that I want to ask Professor Linden. I've been studying, different kind of systems, multipolar systems, unipolarity, all the, number of things that you have mentioned this evening. And something that I have observed with my students is that whenever you have a major systemic shift, something like what you have been, discussing this evening, the next challenge is to restore order. You have to restore another order. This is what happened after the Napoleonic Wars, after the First World War, after the Second World War. And in some cases, the approach is to try to reintegrate the defeated power into the new order. In some other cases, this is, for example, the case of the aftermath of the Second World War. While in other cases, like in the aftermath of the First World War, the approach is to keep, the defeated power, the troublemaker down, basically what has been identified as a troublemaker down. Now, let's say that, this major global confrontation that you have been describing today ends with, in a scenario in which, as I wish, the Russian invasion of Ukraine fails, and the weaknesses that China has turned out to be, so important that China has to renounce its challenge to the American order. What is the approach that we should go for? Should we try to reintegrate, reach out to to Russia and China with, or should we try to keep, to adopt the post-World War I approach and try to keep them down? This is my question.
Thank you, Diego. Any other questions? Okay, so let's take, yeah.
Okay, I'm going to give you the questions that you should have asked me.
But you're going to answer Diego, too.
I don't have any answers because I was hoping nobody would bring this up. But I think Diego's question is certainly a very good one, and it allows me to make a point I should have made earlier. We should not consider that just because a country is relatively weaker or because the situation is seeing them weakening like Russia, that it's less dangerous. In fact, it may be the opposite, that they may get more dangerous, that this goes to the threat of nuclear weapons, as they see themselves having, Diego, the IR theory has this question about whether in this situation a weaker power will try to balance or challenge. It might try to challenge on the grounds that if it has any opportunity to do so, it better do so before it gets much weaker. That's really what I'm worried about with regard to China, as well as Russia. Now, if things are going badly, we better do more rather than less because they're going to get worse and will be frozen out. I think an inclusive approach, if possible, is necessary. But as Yiorghos' correct point about the OSCE demonstrates, when you have different powerful entities in an organization with different policies and orientations, it may not. It's just an organizational representation. I hate to be a realist, but if it's just an organizational representation of national interests, what do you create? A big headquarters with fancy programs, but really it's national states. There are three things I should have been asked.
And should, Yiorghos, do you have anything to add?
I would just stress what Professor Linden said about inclusiveness, to make everybody on the world stage feel that they have a stake and that the structure to be in place should guarantee the indivisible security, that the security of your is not at the expense of my security. inclusiveness.
He's right, of course. The problem is, and I take this as let's imagine an American from Indiana who's never traveled, and he travels to Germany or he travels to Italy, much less Russia, and all of a sudden he sees a perspective on the world that he or she is not familiar with. And the United States, for example, is seen as the big bad bully with 10 million nuclear weapons, and all of a sudden you realize that the different perspectives lead to different conclusions. Inclusiveness, of course, is much better alternative to obviously going at it with weapons, but I'm not sure how you overcome the different view. Remember that both Xi and Putin have a view of the West calling all the shots, making all the institutions, telling them what to do. That's what they want to challenge, whether it's in Ukraine or elsewhere. And this is not the. I can't go. I don't want to into the Ukraine business, but there were two things that I left out that I would have included, but Federigo said, Ron, no more than 2 hours, so I have to stick to that. There are two things I didn't talk almost at all about, and one was climate change, and I don't know quite how to work that into this power structure, but my guess is those who are powerful will get more powerful. Those who are weaker, I don't know the answer to that. The second, and I hinted at this, and so did Yiorghos, is the role of the individual. I think mostly that was sort of crucially forming in my own personal political career of Mikhail Gorbachev. What if that election had produced Likhachev or someone like Andropov, not Mikhail Gorbachev? Think of how the world would have been different. Now you have Putin and you have Xi. I don't know how to quite factor it all in, but those are two factors that should go into a further analysis, it seems to me.
Thank you. I will use my privilege also to ask a question, if we do have a few minutes.
Yeah.
So I have been studying populism and happily concluding that populism is not on the rise when you look at overall party support, though there is this wave of democratic backsliding. So what are some of the reasons you think that we see such prevalent democratic backsliding in regions of the world that were making progress?
Boy, that's a good question. And in fact, I don't exclude the United States, where we came this close to a coup d'etat on January 6th, 2021. The arguments I have seen that apply across countries and you see that a bit in Giorgia Meloni's discussion, the feeling that we're left out. These are the elites. They're making the decisions, and we, however you define we, are left out. And so the old elite, this is especially true in Italy, where you had the same old parties time after time. Decisions are not being made in our interest. They're just being made by an elite, which is not. And so populists, as you well know, I once heard a description of populism as a hitchhiker on the road of causes. And the populists can be from the left, they can be from the right. What they do is plug into that feeling of alienation, and then they infuse it with an ideal dream. I'm going to return to you the real fill in the blank. Hungary, Russia, make America great again. It's the same formula. But I'd like to actually go back to your first assertion about populism not being on the rise. Is there really data to support that?
Yes, in terms of
what about the French elections, the Swedish elections, the German elections?
In terms of mapping it across Europe, you have increase in some countries but decrease in other countries. So even though populists win in some countries, they lose in others.
So where would you put Italy in that respect?
Italy is certainly, with Giorgia Meloni, is on the rise.
Yeah, and I wouldn't count her as a populist, by the way. I mean, I think she's a nationalist.
Yeah.
It's not clear what.
Well, that's another challenge. Yes. But overall, you don't see an overall rise. It is very diverse in each country.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
In a way that, but But by the same token, the democratic decline is real.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Yiorghos.
Yeah, if I may add to that, the Greek experience is telling. The Greeks have been disgruntled and disillusioned. Close to 1/4 of the Greek population fell into poverty through the 15 years of the debt crisis. The Greek debt is over 120% of the GDP. This decadence, this tremendous fall in Greek living standards fed and nurtured the rise of far-right nationalists, the Golden Dawn. Corruption. So the Eurozone is not a panacea. In the countries of the South is seen as Europe as serving mainly the German economy, which is the most powerful, the locomotive of the European economic community. But it's definitely in both Greece and Cyprus in the south. I would say that the majority of the population is against the introduction of the euro. And if I may just add to this that in my last crossing between the northern part of Cyprus, it was less busy, and it was a Turkish Cypriot official there that was checking. She had a working knowledge of Greek, and she retorted to me, why did we drop why did we give away the Cyprus pound? It was so strong. We were better off. In the northern part of Cyprus, they live using the economy the Turkish lira, which has tumbled down tremendously. It was 5 to the dollar 5 years ago. Now there are 20 Turkish liras to the dollar. So they feel more this kind of degradation even in economic standards. And Turkey is aspiring to be an EU member state. So from our perspective in the South, the lack of economic progress definitely nurtured this rise of nationalism.
Thank you. Thank you both. Very quickly, because food is waiting for us, yes?
Yeah, the question is, yesterday...
Could you identify yourself?
Yes, you mean with a passport? Or?
Who are you?
Yeah, I'm Bohumil Patrick. I'm the only Czechoslovak journalist here in Rome. And my question is about, actually yesterday we celebrated on the world, the church celebrated the 10th anniversary of Pope Francis' election. So my question is, you have not talked about this religious aspect, which has become quite important since the invasion, because Pope, just like any other Pope, is very much for the peace. He has received a lot of criticism because some criticize it from being pro-Putin, others not really. So I'm wondering whether this appeal to peace is important in his promotion of culture of encounter. He has visited a couple of countries which have never been visited by Pope. Iraq, United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain, and others are to come. So yeah, I mean, could you please tell us your take on that?
So 2 sentences, and we can take it in the hallway after that, because the worst thing to do to students is to keep them. Thank you.
That's it is an excellent question. And if I had Francis Fukuyama here right now, I would say the thing you missed in that famous end of the history was the role of religion. In particular, I'd have in mind Islam, not Catholicism. And I have to say, not to be too cynical, and I hate to quote Stalin, but he famously said, how many divisions does the Pope have?
At some point he did have. Thank you so much. Thank you for the wonderful event.
Thank you, Yiorghos.